CBS News chief foreign affairs correspondent and moderator of Face the Nation, Margaret Brennan, joins me. Margaret, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is on his way back from Brussels after 2 days of meetings with top officials at NATO headquarters. What came of these meetings?
Well, Nicole, a big part of this trip to Brussels was not just engaging directly with NATO itself, but in these quiet sidelines meetings with some of the smaller countries in Eastern Europe in particular that do have Soviet-era equipment that Ukraine wants to get a hold of. They want to get a hold of it because that's what their military is trained on rather than American-made systems. It takes years sometimes to get up to speed on how to use some of the more complex systems like Patriot missiles, for example. So instead, they're looking at the Soviet-era equipment. Countries don't want to be known for transferring this because they fear that Russia could then in turn target them. So some of the conversations the Secretary of State was having on the sidelines was to help facilitate, help guide, help bless sometimes these transfers to help them quietly happen in a way that doesn't put a target on the back of some of these other Eastern European countries. So while NATO is not willing to directly transfer some of the heavy weapons that Ukraine is asking for, the United States is trying to help facilitate other countries who are NATO members to do it on a bilateral basis, just one-to-one.
The Secretary also addressed the horrific images coming out of Bucha. Here's what he said.
With each day, more and more credible reports of rape, killings, torture are emerging. And for every Bucha, there are many more towns Russia has occupied and more towns it is still occupying, places where we must assume Russian soldiers are committing more atrocities right now.
President Biden has called President Putin a war criminal. Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky told you Sunday he thinks Russia is committing genocide, but Blinken has not. Why?
Well, the Secretary would oversee the legal review at the State Department, that process to make that ultimate determination. And he's parsing words, being careful here because, as you heard from the White House podium this week from Jake Sullivan, they don't believe yet that there is enough of a pattern of behavior of systematic targeting and intent to prove that case legally. Not saying that it isn't ultimately going to be determined, but that it isn't there yet. Now, this may all sound like a lot of legalese to people, and certainly to President Zelensky, who was passionate on Sunday. He was saying that this is not just accidental atrocity that happens in the course of war, that these were targeted killings, that the intent there is to exterminate, that was the word he used, his country and his people. And so that intent to destroy is part of that legal determination of genocide. But at this point, they're just building the case for war crimes. What does all of this mean? Ultimately, it just raises the question of what the West will do to stop it. And we know already that the Biden administration has drawn a very bright line, as have some of these countries within NATO, to say they won't militarily intervene to stop this killing. Instead, they are drawing the line at sanctions and right now at pouring more weapons in. One of the things that was key in terms of describing the president and the United States' point of view at this point is for Secretary Blinken to underscore that the money they're pouring towards weapons right now is to change Vladimir Putin's calculus to get to the negotiating table. He said again today that there is just no diplomacy underway that is credible. And so they're trying to help Ukraine actually win on the battlefield to establish leverage at a future negotiating table. But the bottom line there is no clear timeline, no clear end, and the atrocities are continuing. Ukraine knows that, and they fear that particularly in Mariupol, as President Zelensky said to me on Sunday, that we may see evidence of killing that is even more brutal and even more horrific than the images that have emerged from Bucha.
In the meantime, Russia has stabilized its economy and its currency. The ruble has rebounded largely because Russia imposed strict capital controls to keep cash inside of the country. Does this mean that sanctions have not been effective?
Well, this gets us back to that fundamental question of what is the intention of the sanctions. And remember, President Biden, right after this invasion back in February, stood before reporters at the White House and said, let's check back in a month, when he was asked why the sanctions weren't deterring Vladimir Putin. So that was an acknowledgement that the White House knew these sanctions weren't going to stop or prevent, they were going to punish. Now we are more than a month in. That was the timeline the president laid out. We are about 6 weeks or more into this conflict, and clearly the sanctions haven't stopped anything when it comes to the battlefield. What they have done is strangled the economy. Clearly Vladimir Putin is willing to take on that pain. Clearly the Russian people may be feeling the effects of it. But in terms of changing the mindset of that inner circle for Vladimir Putin and his top intelligence and military advisors, it hasn't made that difference yet. So this is a slow strangulation and isolation of Russia alongside the slow bleed of the Ukrainian people. And so when you say, do the sanctions work or not, they are certainly severing a lot of Russia's ties to the West in a way that may be, if not irreversible, then pretty close to it. I mean, very severely damaging the ability to interact with the rest of the international community. But they haven't actually made a difference yet on the battlefield. There are reports U.S. intelligence will point to saying that they are seeing issues with getting a hold of parts, of getting a hold of things that would allow for factories to continue running. So you may see some sort of effect on ability to access goods by Russia. But so far, they are figuring out ways to keep things going. And a big part of that is because they still have those gas contracts that many European countries are continuing to pay on because they are reliant on Russian energy. So billions of dollars in the form of rubles or euros is still to the benefit of Vladimir Putin.
The Pentagon confirmed the U.S. has been actively training Ukrainians to operate Switchblade drones. That revelation came after Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley said this to Congress, quote, the potential for significant international conflict between great powers is increasing, not decreasing. So can the U.S. meet Ukraine's pleas for more weapons without being a part of that increased tension?
That is the push-pull here. That is the policy debate that is happening. And there are many who would argue Vladimir Putin already believes he's in a conflict directly with NATO and already believes he's in a conflict with the United States. What the Biden administration is really trying hard to do is to say we're not directly going to be party to this conflict. And that is why there has been this hand-wringing and debate over the type of weapons handed over, not just because of practical reasons in terms of what the Ukrainians are actually trained on, but also what crosses the line in a way that could be used to justify targeting the United States. Now, why would Vladimir Putin risk pulling the United States or NATO into a war he appears to be losing? That doesn't sound rational. Well, when I put that question to a Pentagon official recently, I was told that is one reason that the United States revealed they don't believe in U.S. intelligence circles that Vladimir Putin is getting reliable information. In other words, they're afraid that an emotional, cornered Vladimir Putin may not be making rational decisions. Not to say that he is not rational, but that he could potentially risk escalating. So when you hear the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who is the top military advisor of President Biden, Mark Milley, describe that, that's what he's getting towards. The risk of miscalculation only appears to be rising in their view as it becomes more and more apparent that Vladimir Putin is not getting honest assessments of what's happening on the ground and could risk escalating. But if you look at the facts on the ground, many would argue Russia's military has proven it is not 10 feet tall. It did not meet any of its targets that were laid out by the Kremlin. They weren't able to capture the capital of Ukraine, for example. So perhaps the risk there is something that should be viewed with some skepticism. This is one of the big policy debates. But as you heard the president's top military advisors say, they don't want to escalate further. And so that is what's driving the decision making at this point.
Margaret Brennan, thank you for your analysis. And remember, you can watch Face the Nation right here on CBS News. It streams at 12 p.m. and 4 p.m. Eastern every Sunday.